Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of HR Tech Chat. And today's episode is going to be very engaging and interesting and intriguing for you all. I know this for a fact because every single conversation I have with our guest, Dr. Tom Tonkin, is absolutely fascinating. Uh, Tom is the CEO of the Conservatory Group, and he and I are both alumni, I guess. We worked on the same team of Cornerstone on Demand, where that's where we first began to have our occasional deep discussions around human capital management, all this kind of stuff. Um, Tom has a pretty interesting background and welcome to the chat, Tom. Thank you for joining us. If you want to share with the viewers a little bit more about your background, just so we all know where you're coming from, and then we can get into some of the stuff we want to talk about.
Yeah, that's excellent, Brent. And I appreciate you taking the time. And yes, you would think after all those conversations you and I had that we would have the world would just be a better place because we talked about those things. I like to consider myself what I call a recovering executive. Uh, the times that we have spent in corporate America has taught me a lot of things. Um, I am an academic as well, and I've gotten to be a point where I've sort of dabbled in all sorts of things. I think probably the most interesting part about my background, because again, people could Google and find me LinkedIn and other places, so I won't go down that path. But it really has been around trying to understand people's behavior and why those behaviors occurred. And though that sounds like a broad topic, it really isn't once you start instantiating. And again, you and I are going to have this conversation as it develops. You know, not only my academic, but also my professional background has been around that. And that's been instantiated in sales, and learning and development, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that's always been my fascination, is around what makes us tick, what's the behavior, and how can we become better versions of ourselves.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. And and let's talk about that a little bit. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it is front and center in HCM these days, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening around it. Excuse me, my contact is bothering me. Okay, it's better now. Um, and I don't want to get let the horse out of the barn. I want to let you let the horse out of the barn here. But we've had some very interesting conversations around DE&I, and around how technology can help with that, and but also around ideas around of empathy and versus authenticity and all these sorts of things. And people are using some of these words, well-intentioned, but not exactly accurately. And um, I'll let you elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to start with a sort of giving ourselves a running start as to how someone of my social position ended up in this sort of diversity and inclusion space. It was never really my intention, honestly, to get into this. I started many years ago, both in a professional and an academic trail, and I started looking at cultures. That's really where this whole thing really emanated for me, doing a lot of research in the different cultures of the world. And I landed in the gaps in gender equality. And that just became fascinating to me and very, very academic perspective. I found myself at one point, 2012, speaking in front of many women at a leadership conference about diversity and inclusion. And I have to admit to you and the listeners is that was probably one of my more intimidating presentations I've ever had as a man. And because of that presentation, I then moved on in 2000, I think it was 13 or 14, to present to the first annual International Leadership Association for Women in Silmar, California. And I spoke in front, again, to many women, over 400. And the whole concept really not only fascinated me as a academic, but it also fascinated me and arguably made me angry about the inequalities that occurred on not only gender, but as I dove into it, race, creed, religion, sexual orientation, and then as you and I will talk, neurodiversity, and all of these different pockets. And so I continue to dive into that research more so. And the next thing you know, I'm blogging, I'm writing. I am part of startups in the technology industry that are trying to solve this problem. And I think, that's the basis for why you and I are having this conversation today is this thing started probably 15 years ago for me. And here we are. And so again, I'm going to thank you for giving me another platform to have this conversation, because I think not only is it important from an HR tech perspective, but I also think it's important from a societal perspective.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is. And there's so many paths we could go down right now. But let me ask you, coming out of those sort of initial experiences, those seminal experiences that you had in the space where you found yourself sort of, it sounds like you fell into it a little bit, and you found yourself speaking in front of that women's conference, and then returning, I believe, the next year. And what is so we understand sort of the events that have shaped your understanding of DE&I. What is your philosophy or your what is your sort of assessment of DE&I today? A, and B, what is your philosophy toward it? What's your take? What's your feeling about it?
Well, I think they're my goodness, that alone, right? It's going to consume a lot of our time. But I would say that it's a real problem. I think first and foremost, I think there's a lot of trends where people will say some of these are myths or that. No, there's plenty of strong research that would suggest that if you take a look at all the minorities, that there is a problem. On the other hand, I'm going to say things that arguably may go against popular opinion. One of those things would be, for example, in the gender world, if we plan on solving the inequities between gender, I speak specifically about male and female, the male population needs to participate in that rectification. And I think that's important as HR professionals out there are looking to create efforts around their organizations, diversity and inclusion officers, right? We're looking at a lot of chief diversity officers coming into the picture. It's important that all parties associated with that diversity are part of that. I think what's happening is there's a trend to the exclusion of different people. There are in the HR world, there's these things called affinity groups or employee resource groups, which tend to give voice to that particular group, whether it be gender or race or whatever it may be. And it does a very good job of the representation, but it does a very poor job on the advancement of the equity. And sometimes, for example, I've seen many women's groups that are solely composed of women. Again, great opportunity for representation, but not a good opportunity for advancement. And I would suggest the academic research supports that assertion that ERGs from an advancement perspective are ineffective. They are effective for representation. And I think that's the first step, but it's certainly not going to rectify any inequality in the workplace unless we start having male allyship, or let's say a Black ERG doesn't have a white allyship. That's where the advancement will come from. And I'm not necessarily sure that that message is resonating in the workplace just yet.
That's interesting. That's really interesting because, and there's also some, there's some camaraderie that occurs when you have, exclusively women's group or exclusively men's group, right? There's some of that camaraderie that occurs too. It's positive, right? But in speaking, I'm kind of reiterating some of the things that you said, but just to think my way through it, right? This idea that a women's group forming, exclusive, comprising solely female membership, right? That's great for what I'm hearing you say. That's great for getting the ball rolling. It's great for representation. It's the planting the flag in the sand, if you will, right? But then where these efforts are losing steam or maybe moving in not quite the best direction is where they they um, they they retain or they double down on this female only membership or whatever the group is, and that comes from a good place because they're seeking solidarity, and there's sort of a shared confidence building for themselves in that. But what you're saying is that does not necessarily advance their actual aim, which is to achieve that equity, whether it be in pay or that inclusion in terms of company leadership or whatnot.
Yeah.
Um, let's go back to male allyship, because I think that's super important. When you think about it, right, it is diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So why wouldn't you want, let's put it differently. You definitely would want to include the group that maybe, needs to hear a new perspective or would benefit from hearing a new perspective, so that it might adjust its own view on the matter.
No, yeah, let's go. Let me top off, a few other ideas around these ERGs as it pertains to advancement, right? So let's compartmentalize the conversation between representation and advancement. So again, strong with representation, right? This is a voice. You get a chance to talk. You get a chance to air out the issues. However, when I say advancement, I'm talking about real equity, whether it be pay, whether it be a voice in business issues. I don't know, having the sensitivities to associated benefits that may come from from the company to these different groups is just not there. And here's an interesting research fact. And by the way, those that are listening right now, you might want to pull out a pen and paper because I tend to start rattling off references on certain things. One of the issues around resource groups is that it appears that when we talk about it, the problem is solved. And there's it sounds, arguably it sounds ridiculous, but it's true from a research perspective. When we talk about it, it sounds like we've that's a very interesting book. That's not necessarily DE&I, but it speaks to this. It's a book called The Knowing Doing Gap by Jeffrey Pfeffer and Robert Sutton. And the idea, there's a gap between what we know we need to do and what we actually do. And one of the issues, there's 5 issues in the book, and one of the issues talks about this talking sounds a lot like doing. Mm. And when we start putting out ERGs or affinity groups and talking about the issue, it appears as if that advancement is taking place, when in reality, it just isn't. There's other research out there that would actually corroborate that point. For example, there has been everything from formal to informal research that would have a before and an after employee resource groups. So before ERG is created, give me your sentiment on whether or not your company is inclusive, and usually the scores are very low.
Yeah.
ERG rolls around, basically these affinity groups, which provide representation, but no advancement. You come and ask the same people the same question, and all of a sudden it's 25, the score is 25% better.
Mhm.
And yet nothing has really happened.
Yeah.
And so there's this false sense um, of advancement when there really isn't. Another book that's interesting to look at, or more of a theory, is Edgar Schein's organizational culture theory.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks the division of a culture between the top would be an artifact, followed by values, followed by beliefs. And the problem is what's happening right now in the DEI world is we're fabricating a lot of artifacts,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not changing our values, beliefs, and assumptions of those artifacts. So what I mean by an artifact would be an ERG, an affinity group,
Mm-hmm.
or a post or a web page, something that says, look, we're inclusive, or look, we're diverse, look at us, or we support the diversity in the workplace. These are all artifacts and they're great. I'm not diminishing that. However, for them to have true advancement effect, you also have to change the values and the beliefs and the assumptions below, which I think sometimes goes unnoticed and unchanged.
How how essential are these ERGs to the sort of the end goal, to the holistic process? Are they, maybe you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah,
Are
I mean,
they
they are
oh,
essential. I mean,
okay.
but the problem is if you imagine, if we were on a whiteboard in your mind's eye, and I go back to those three levels, you'd have artifact is the thing that exposes
Mm,
your values and beliefs, right? And then you have your values and beliefs, and then you have your associated assumptions below that. And what a lot of people are doing now is they're starting at the top.
yeah,
Let's build these things. It's again, you and I worked at Cornerstone Learning, right? I used to have this conversation with our customers where you would say, just because you bought an LMS doesn't make you a learning organization.
right.
Uh, a real simple one is I can stand in a garage, and does that make me a car? It sounds silly, but that's the analogy to what it is that we're talking about. And so yeah, it's again, I say it in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, but there's a lot of reality to it. The values, beliefs, and assumptions have to change. So my advice to everyone out there is really has to start at the bottom. What are your assumptions about values, about equity? What are your values and beliefs about equity? And eventually what would happen, the natural gravitation is, what's the vehicle that I'm going to use to expose those values and beliefs in the corporation, which come in the form of affinity groups and ERGs. So I
Right.
think it's well intentioned, but I think we're going about it from sort of that top down perspective than that more bottom up.
Well, if you go from the bottom up direction, right, then your ERG is a little bit more has maybe a higher consciousness level. Is a little bit more has a little bit more informed. It's a little bit more self-aware of what's going on with itself, right? It would be interesting to get to a point, and I think this is what you're talking about, where organizations or groups, they realize when they form an ERG that this is an important step, but it doesn't end here. We're going to have to do something else eventually. We're going to have to evolve in order to get to the advancement stage of things. It occurred to me that with an ERG, it is essential, not just for the representation part of it, but also not just to establish that representation, but it's also probably essential for the to buoy the confidence and the positivity in the group that's looking to make the change in the organization itself. You yourself said that after an ERG is formed, you survey that, or you poll that same organization, it feels that diversity has been solved, or that it's better, right? And it isn't actually, but maybe it is a little bit, but on a sort of an attitudinal in an attitudinal way, right? They've made that step. It seems to me that positive feeling, shared feeling in the group is absolutely essential to moving to the next step. And the idea is to educate organizations and groups that there is a next step that is beyond the ERG, that has to look a lot different.
As a formation of any group or any program, you obviously should have goals and metrics and ways to measure it. And I think sometimes, again, I think we're sort of harping on the ERG, but use that term as that artifact of whatever it might be exposing in your organization as the goal itself. Like, let's form one. Let's get all of the people that are the minority in whatever the ERG group is focused on. And that's the goal, is attendance and discussion. And hey, that's all great, but that can't be the goal, right? That's what I would call the leading indicators to eventually what would be a lagging indicator when we do see equity in pay, when we do see opportunity for those in a corporate world that are minorities. Until those numbers change, I don't think we've solved the problem yet. And you got to go back to the ERGs, the affinity groups, or whatever that artifact is, and see how useful it is.
What are the next steps? Is there sort of are there some best practices here? We talked a little bit about it, about including some of the so for women's equality, for instance, equity and gender equity, for instance, right? Gender equity.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question. I don't want to cut you off here, but I because I know where you're headed with this, and there's probably a preface to what your question is, and so I want to cut you off here.
Yeah, that there's a best practice versus it looks different everywhere.
Correct. And so let's talk a little bit about the acronym.
Yeah.
So it wasn't too long ago when it was DE&I, diversity and inclusion, and then it became DE&I, and now it's DEI and B, belonging.
Yeah.
And I think I want to have a little conversation about that, so then I can answer your question.
Yeah.
So the way this all started was D&I. Those are the two things that an organization is responsible for. I need to be diverse and I need to be inclusive. In layman's term is diversity, you get invited to the party. Inclusion, you get invited to dance.
Yeah.
So these are organizational processes and structures in place. Everything from recruiting to performance management to all of the talent management phases. What's happened is an organization can do all of that and still leave the people in the company empty and actually not realizing the goal. And the goal, by the way, is equity and belonging.
Right.
So D&I are the organizational contributing factors. E and B are the way those minorities feel and are treated.
Yeah.
And so there's still that disconnect between those two things. So when you come out with a plan, the question is organization, leadership, whatever you're talking to. Yes, diversity and inclusion. It's your responsibility to start. However, the implementation or the how has to connect to those feel like they have equity or equality and they feel like they belong. I mean, again, some of this stuff, I always bring it down to some common denominator. Right? You can get invited to the party when you're a teenager but all the cool kids are in the corner, right? And all the nerds are like, wallflowers, which by the way, I sympathize because I was one of those nerds. And so, yeah, I got invited, but boy, I didn't feel belonging, nor did I feel like I had any kind of equality with the cool kids.
I have one up on you. I had to crash those parties, but it's just kidding. No, no, no.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what's interesting here is uh, it's interesting to see the acronym evolving with our sort of our collective understanding of what this really is about, right? And I like which is I was trying to figure out. I don't think there's really a rhyme or reason around. It's not like it was diversity, and then once you have when you have diversity, then the end goal of diversity is equity, because the end goal of diversity is also inclusion and belonging. But the end goal of inclusion is also equity and belonging. It's interesting. Um, Neurodiversity, though. I want to make sure that we hit on neurodiversity, because that to me is a really interesting sort of frontier of thinking around what diversity is. To me, as important as diversity is in terms of skin color and ethnicity and all that sort of thing, that's very important. But to me, we really start to get to the nut of what true diversity is when we talk about neurodiversity.
Yeah, let's dive into that, because that's my latest research passion and understanding. Is So I did all of this stuff back when it was not cool, if I may say so.
Yeah.
When everyone kind of thought that diversity inclusion was just going to happen because we're all good people, and it just didn't. I mean, I'm not stating any surprises here. And then what happened was a lot of people became vocal. A lot of obviously the social issues manifested themselves through the multiple racial unrest that we've had in this country. And what happened is you had ethnic and racial people uh, speak out and be very vocal, and you had sexual orientation issues, and you had gender issues, right? All of these parades and these efforts became very vocal and became very apparent to everybody in the world, and actions being taken. Meanwhile, there's a very interesting group that we're leaving out, which is
Mm.
those that are what is called neurodiverse. Neurodiverse are people that are on the autistic spectrum.
Mm.
I basically am talking about those that have Asperger's, that are highly functional, but they have this condition, and the condition looks a lot like social awkwardness and the inability to express themselves, and very hidden and introverted in all that they do, which goes completely against everything that makes diversity inclusion alive, which is
Yeah.
having your own voice in parades and all this other stuff. So I felt compelled to say, look, there's a lot of people now in diversity inclusion that have jumped on that. A lot of people that are getting it right or getting it wrong, or they're working through it. I got to tell you, as a thought leader in this space, I'm allowing all that sort of to happen. And no one needs another log in the fire from me on that one.
Yeah.
I'm spending my time on neurodiversity and exploring that and trying to find what we can do to help those in that spectrum. I'll give you a fascinating and very sad statistic. 74% of the people we know in the autistic spectrum world are unemployed. I'll
Mm.
just let that number sit with you and your listeners. Imagine if I were to say that about any other group on the planet. We would be
Yeah.
outraged. And yet, here we are. And why is that? Well, I'm going to tell you. Our world is built in what's called a neurotypical world. There are expectations that we have of people in social and professional settings that go against every neurodiverse person, and therefore they can't fit. I equate a neurodiverse person sitting in a collaborative meeting similar to a person in a wheelchair looking at a set of steps. It's just like, how do I manage and navigate that? Well, we certainly would never allow a physically disabled person not to be able to conquer those steps, whether ramps or elevators or whatever it might be. And yet, we're expecting neurodiverse people to collaborate and speak up and speak their mind and all this, which is completely against that. And somehow that behavior appears as if they're disengaged, they don't understand what's going on, and we somehow slot them lower in the chain than we would anybody else. So that gives you a perspective of what it is, the issue that we currently have with that group.
It's interesting. I know it's just a slight tangent, but it's super interesting to me that with neurodiverse people, um, that we assume so we assume that they are or that they are fully capable. Like we assume that, and we can't see inside their head, and we don't realize that they are they have challenges, but they also have and I want to make sure we cover this too. There was a very interesting corporate case study around this that was done, but that there's that they just think differently, and that we should be adapting how we do things to or we should be excuse me we should be flexible so we can flex to what they do so that they can be as helpful as possible, which we actually need. When speaking about more conventional, like traditional diversity, right? It's, the issue has been people sort of making judgments about others based on how they look or who they are, and not realizing that they are potentially exactly like us, right? So it's the inverse. It's very interesting. That's why I think neurodiversity is so. That's why it's so fascinating to me, and why I think it really gets to. It's a full circle, real sort of deep dive into diversity. Um,
So there's a couple terms I'd like to introduce in this conversation, and hopefully it proliferates into your listeners' lexicon. But there's a difference between stereotype and archetype,
ah,
right? And stereotypes are, a microcosm of our experience. And some of the stereotype traits are obviously true,
yeah,
but a lot of them aren't. And usually stereotypes are also, it's just a way for our brain to compartmentalize and make it easy for us to categorize our experiences in the world. Archetypes, on the other sense, is our set of components that help us build up into
mm,
an instantiation of an individual. And so think of stereotypes as sort of that top down generalization. Think of archetypes as a bottom up aggregation of components
yeah,
and traits, in this case of people. And what's interesting about neurodiversity is when you're talking about white, black, male, female, it's arguably for the most part very apparent because
mm,
you can see it. However, neurodiverse people are black, are white, are men, are female, are everything.
yeah,
And you cannot see it. The only way you see it is through their behavior, which again is not how we have looked at diversity in that lens. We've never taken a look at, let's say, a woman and say, I'm paying attention to your behavior. Maybe we should, right? I mean,
yeah,
we look at them whether they're female or born female, and we then use the stereotype to then take a look at them. Where if we were to take a look at an archetype and look at their behavior, and we would have much more interesting conversations, and arguably get to know people a little more. I want to share an interesting story. It's actually part of my research for my book on sincerity. Out of all people, Alan Alda, everyone
yeah.
knows Alan Alda from MASH. He's gotten into a whole discussion and a thought process around empathy. So Alan Alda is going to make my book where he talks about empathy. And one of the exercises that he talks about is um, noticing what other people are thinking or feeling. And he says, how can I become a better empathetic person? Well, maybe as I look at people and try to guess their insides a little bit by maybe the way they behave and all that. What was very interesting about that is a researcher picked up on that premise from Alan Alda and made it a real research project.
Oh, really? Okay.
And then what he found was a couple things. Number one, yes, people became more empathetic, but not for the reason you think. They didn't become empathetic because they kind of guessed right of what the people were. They became more empathetic just because they noticed other people. That's it. They
Really?
just noticed other people.
Wow.
And what I'm saying is that can apply across the board with everything, but actually can apply to those in a neurodiverse world. And it works on that, what I call that archetype, that component accumulation towards a person. What are their behaviors? What are they thinking? What's their background? You know, these are all the components to an archetype of what makes an individual. And that's significantly more interesting than anything that we've talked about as far as diversity is in inclusion.
I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure we touch on the technology piece of this.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. How does technology help organizations? And if you could also quickly share the example. There was a corporate team example that I think we had a discussion around previously around. They brought in some neurodiverse people and they were able to.
Yes.
If you would you share that with listeners first, and then let's touch on some of this technology.
Yeah. So there are actually two case studies that are out there. One of them is SAP, and SAP recognized this as an issue, meaning the neurodiverse issue, and they decided to build a business that would exclusively hire those of neurodiversity. Now, one of the interesting things about people that are neurodiverse is they're very loyal. Their moral compass is very high, but they have a superpower of focus. And SAP has a group which focuses on debugging and finding bugs on their code with neurodiverse people. And that particular group has generated over $30 million of savings of finding things that would take what usually would take longer down the software development process much earlier. And anybody in the tech world, as people are listening to now, know that if you catch the bug earlier, that's cheaper than catching it when you're deploying and early down.
Yeah.
Well, SAP has more than paid for this entire group because they had that. Now, Microsoft, by the way, is another organization that's very, very high on the neurodiverse development and hiring and usefulness. So this isn't a hiring what might consider a disabled person. I think it's a very capable, but a different capable. It's a superpowers that they do have. And so I encourage people to really take a look at a lot of the books out there. There's a whole bunch of neurodiverse resources out there. Now, let's talk a little bit about the technology as time closes out on us.
Yeah.
Hopefully by now your listeners are bought in. Right? They're thinking, okay, Tom, we're in now. What are you doing? I'm actually involved in two different startup organizations. One's called Sammy Games. Another one's called Diversity, Equity, Inclusion.com. And Sammy Games, basically, without getting into a lot of the, by the way, it's sammygames.co if anybody wants to go and connect and talk a little bit about that. Really is kind of a sort of a bottom-up view. We've been talking about this whole archetype and components. Basically, the software tool, it aggregates what is really happening in the workplace at its lowest level and provides immediate solutions to those problems. So it's not a top-down view. For example, if I'm having problems with a coworker, let's say you're taking the credit for my work, how do I solve that problem? How do I understand how that problem is? Well, in the past, we would say, hey, go to the leadership books and, you'll figure it out. And people are like, look, I don't have time for that. I just need this problem. So it's a very inductive view of data, right? There's a place where people can talk about it. And you can see how that can work in a diversity and inclusion culture, where it's like, how am I dealing with my disparate or diverse team and no one's listening to me? That's one thing. Diversity, equity, inclusion.com, which really supports a product called DE&Dynamics, which is a diversity and equity inclusion assessment tool, is sort of the other end of the spectrum. It's like, where are you as a company, as a person, right? It does very in-depth surveys and assessments that generate reports not only to the organization, but also to the individual to say, what is it that I can do in where I am? And this is, the philosophy is pretty simple. Again, it's very inductive, right? From the bottom up, but also it draws a line as to where you are, right? Everyone has a very self-righteous view of their beliefs, but I can tell you that you and I, and research will bear this, we have biases. It's just, it is. And most of our biases are unconscious, very difficult to change. The secret to changing unconscious bias is to make it conscious. Okay. And that's the only way. You cannot change an unconscious bias in its unconscious state. You have to move it forward, basically, to that executive function in your brain to say, oh, I am biased towards, fill in the blank. Okay, now that I know that, I can fix it. And that's what these assessments are made for.
We can go another 5 minutes or so. And because I want to ask you a couple follow-up questions around the technology here, because I think this is super important for HCM, for talent, right? So, and you might have known that I would go here. We have a lot of artificial intelligence being applied into talent acquisition right now. Okay, and
almost right under the wire.
I slipped right in there, almost made it. But seriously though, right? We have program, and this is a larger issue across the industry, where there's a real concern about who's programming this AI and what it's looking for, because people are already starting to use it. And what the AI isn't, I don't know if it's quite where some of the alarmists say it is right now, but let's just leave that behind for the moment, right? There is some AI that's being used in talent acquisition, right? And, and presumably in the, at least in some way, in the selection of people, right? At least the people who make it to the past the sourcing round, maybe, right? How can we, what's going on there? I'm kind of answering the question. I'm just looking for your take on this, or your reaction, right? I mean, I think that some of this neurodiversity conversation needs to make its way into the programming of these algorithms.
Here's the issue I have currently with AI. Like technology, far be it from me to suggest that AI is not going to get there, but I don't think AI is there now for this issue. And let me tell you why. So the fact is that AI needs to be programmed, and they're programmed by people that have unconscious bias. I just explained to you that the only way that I can remove unconscious bias is to make it conscious, because I can only deal with it. If I'm a programmer and I'm not dealing with my own, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to transfer that unconscious bias into the software. I've always been a proponent of software as being a proxy to how we treat and connect to people. And I'm talking about this part of talent management, the diversity part. Technology is a proxy to how we want to deal. It's a scalability thing, or it's an automation thing. It's a calculative thing, right? It's making us better and faster. And until we can remove our own unconscious bias prior to programming this proxy that I'm calling artificial intelligence, all we're doing is we're scaling an unconscious bias.
Mm.
Your listeners can go to Google and see the famous Amazon case study when they tried to do that. They tried to use AI for recruiting, and it didn't work. It was actually more bias than people were because it scaled it. I always said that if you install software on a bad idea, all you're doing is enabling and scaling a bad idea.
Yeah.
So you're going to do bad things quicker and bigger. So you have to make sure that your ideas are correct before you enable and scale them through software.
Yeah. Scaling that narrow perspective, unconscious perspective that group in aggregate, programmers, programmers typically are a certain kind of, they have a certain sort of temperament and attitude, right? So that's, yeah, it's something to think about. And
Here's another neuroscience view of things. So I'm going to use these numbers loosely, but you get the idea. So when we're conscious, we're getting about 136 pieces of information at us that we're consciously picking up: temperature of the room, lighting, word sounds. Our unconscious brain is picking up about 2 million pieces of information at that same time. We use those 2 million pieces of information to inform us about our environment and the people we interact with. To think that we can somehow program 2 million pieces of information that we don't even know what it is seems a far-fetched proposition. Again, will we get there someday? Oh, I absolutely do. But that's the problem what we're faced with right now.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Huge challenge. Great stuff, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will, when we post this chat, just for viewers, when we post this chat, we'll include links to the sites that Tom mentioned, and we'll have to do this again.
Oh, well, we often do. We just need to hit the record button. Isn't that right?
That's right. That's right. That's right.
The world's a better place when Brent and I talk. They just don't know it.
That's right. That's right. We gotta get out of our shell. Thanks so much, Tom. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thanks for the time, and goodbye, everybody.
Absolutely. Take care. Bye-bye.